things that we, think normally happen when things go really bad and therefore they won't because of our optimism bias, right? That's what's going to happen. Now that is very sad, but it is also, I think, an inevitable reality at this point, and we have to recognise that we have to go to that point, understand what that looks like and feels like, and get ready to respond, right? Because that's the moment when we decide what kind of civilization we want. That's the moment when we get to choose what we're capable of as humans, as a species. Now, the reason I take you there, and take myself there, and take audiences there, and go there in the book, is because I do believe we need to get to that point to understand what happens next. And it's very hard, right, not to stay there. So some of you will now be sitting in that place and going, oh, God, I hope he's wrong. I hope he's just trying to scare the crap out of us so we get more motivated. Couldn't be that bad. Nah. Well, could be that. No, it couldn't be that bad. Could be that bad. The point is you have to go there and then you've got to move on. You've got to move on because once you recognise that, then suddenly everything becomes possible. When you think about a crisis of that scale, when you think about an understood, undenied, existential threat to the future of civilization, then what we need to do actually becomes pretty easy. Whereas now what we need to do seems impossible. The idea now of the end of growth, reforming the financial system, right, ending consumerism, recognising there is life after shopping, right? I know that's the biggest shock of all. I just sort of threw it in there to shock you when you weren't looking for it. There is life after shopping. That stuff doesn't seem possible today. And if you were in Europe before World War II and you painted what was going to happen, if you explained the scenario that was about to unfold and thought about the level of suffering and tragedy, thought about the horror, thought about the industrial mobilisation that occurred, thought about the US going from 1.6% of GDP on military spending to 36% of GDP in 4 years, right? Thought about, the government saying to the auto industry 4 days after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, you don't produce cars anymore, now you produce tanks for the war effort, right? Incomprehensible, unimaginable, and then just done. Just suddenly just done. So all the things that we need to do that seem so impossible are only actually achievable, right, when you think about a crisis context, when we think about that kind of response. Now, some people argue, in my space, I live in a very strange world of people who think about the world falling apart for a living. It's a fortunately small club because we're all kind of depressed maniacs because you have to kind of be to get there. But in that world, right, people say, oh, but some people say it'll be too late. Right? There's a point where it's too late, where the system gets out of control, where the Arctic melts, where the methane's released, where the system feeds back upon itself and it's all over. It's as though there's only two kind of outcomes here. One outcome is that we wake up, we fix things up, we start doing things properly and then nothing goes wrong, or else it's the end of civilization and it's the end of the species, right? Neither of those are going to happen, right? It's not going to all be okay, and it's not the end of the species, right? The answer is somewhere in between, and that's the choice that we make. The choice that we make is where do we go on that dial? And so a very important question is, well, how fast could we change it? How fast could we fix it if we really wanted to? If there was a crisis where we got motivated and decided to actually respond in a big way, what would that look like? So I wanted to know that. So I worked with Professor Jürgen Randers, who's one of the authors of the Club of Rome Limits to Growth report in 1972, a good friend of mine. And we asked the question, so what would we do, heaven forbid, for the world if we were in charge? Right? If we really thought there was a need to fix climate change, and they didn't ask us until sort of the end of this decade, because we figured it would take them a while to find our phone number and stuff. But when they found us at the end of 2018 or so, what would that look like and how would we do it? And so we spent a couple of years working on the plan, right? Not to transform the global economy, we're leaving that to you, but just to fix climate change, right? And we spent a couple of years working that through with modelers at MIT about what that would look like. And could you do it? If you started at the end of this decade, could you still fix climate change? And the answer is, and you can get the plan off my website, downloaded, is it's actually pretty easy and it's actually pretty cheap. You can do it with proven technology, at an affordable cost and surprisingly with existing political structures. right? And it is, I mean, I don't want to say it's sort of very cheap, it is pretty cheap. It's definitely less than the cost of a collapsing civilization. Now, I must confess we didn't precisely model the cost of a collapsing civilization, but we asked a few people and they said it's very expensive. So our plan is definitely cheaper. But seriously, it's not like World War II, right? It's much less than that. It's less of a technical challenge, it's less of a financial challenge, it's less of a political challenge, right? And you can do that and you can eliminate net CO2 emissions from the economy inside about 20 years, right? Then you can absorb 6 gigatons a year for the rest of the century. You can get warming down to 1 degree, where it more or less is now, 350 parts per million, and you can do it in a very manageable way. So the point of that is not that we have kind of the actual plan, and there aren't ways to improve it, and there's not technologies that we haven't thought about yet that will come into play. The point is, you know, I am absolutely convinced that we are capable of addressing this issue and preventing collapse, and we can do it, you know, in some time to come when we have some time left. There is not a point where it's too late, as long as you acknowledge that change will happen that dramatically. The reason that's important for your work is because you've got to really imagine that big, right? What we did that no one else had done before was to imagine how to fix it. Everyone else had been thinking about what's the best we can do, what's the most realistic, achievable, incremental step that we can take. That's why we think about 2 degrees on climate change, for example, because we think it's realistic. No scientists are saying 2 degrees is a good idea. I mean, think about the global negotiations on climate change, which have completely failed to achieve their objective of 450 ppm and 2 degrees of warming. That objective is to get us a 50% chance of not going past 2 degrees. 2 degrees is the point where every conservative climate scientist says the system goes into overload and breakdown and tipping points, right? So you imagine you're running an organisation, a company, and you go to the boss and you say, here's my strategy. There's a 50% chance this will destroy the company, 50% chance it won't. And we think we've got that more or less right. It could be a bit worse, but that's about what we have in mind. Do you think anyone's going to agree to that? And that's just a company. We're talking about the future of humanity. And the objective of our political process is to achieve a 50% chance of survival. Right? So that is madness. What we need to do is a lot more than that. And just think about this in terms of the economic consequences of what we're saying here. So on that particular issue, if we had an 80% chance, and I would actually like more than 80% chance of survival personally, but let's assume 80% chance of achieving 2 degrees, what it means is 75% of the existing proven reserves of oil, coal and gas can never be burnt, right? And therefore are existing on the asset sheets of today's companies that aren't worth anything. So that's what we refer to as the carbon bubble, that there is a massive amount of inbuilt value in this economy which assumes that we're going to burn all the fossil fuels that we've got, right? That assumes therefore we'll go to 3, 4 or 5 degrees of warming, which therefore assumes it's the collapse of civilization. Right? That's what all these oil companies are planning for. That's what the coal companies are planning for. That's what they're assuming. They have a policy of supporting a 2 degree temperature target, and they have a business strategy of 4 or 5 degrees. So the point of saying that is not because they're evil or stupid or whatever. I mean, some of them actually are, but not many of them. The point of saying that is to say that there is just this tension in the system which is going to break. Right? So we have on the one hand this incredible economic momentum and infrastructure guiding us towards a process which we know is unachievable and unsustainable in the physical sense. And then we have a direction over here that science is saying we need to go to. So that tension is going to break, right? And when that tension breaks, we are going to have an economic crisis, right? We are going to have the collapse of a number of companies and we're going to have a transformation. And the reason that's important is because that's the world we need to plan for. That's why we need to think big. That's why we need to imagine, right, having a zero CO2 emitting economy over a few decades. That's why we need to imagine solar power, etc., rolling out at a scale incomprehensible in today's markets. That's why we need to imagine life after shopping. Right? That's why we need to think about a meme in the world that says, you know, it actually is possible to be happier with less stuff, because we're going to have less stuff. Right? It means we're going to have to think about what life looks like with less money. Right? And of course, I won't give you the part of my talk about why that's possible and why we know that works, because we all know their data. The data is this: more stuff doesn't make you happy. There's a great thing I'm an ambassador for in Australia, which is just actually coming to the Netherlands, called Buy Nothing New Month. Right? The idea of actually buying nothing new for a month. Right? And we launched this campaign in Australia, and I gave a talk here in December last year, and a local woman's picked it up and is going to run it here, which is great news. People are totally shocked. You know, not buy anything new for a month? Apart from food. Although that wouldn't hurt some of us either. Is the idea of not shopping, the idea of not buying new stuff is so incomprehensible to us that we need kind of I call this a detox program. It's a detox program for shopping. It's a detox program that says actually, you know, because everyone does this program and then works out, you know, actually, credit card bill's lower, things are fine, spent more time with my friends, you know, all these things have suddenly become possible. So let me just sum up and stop and say again, we are going to do big things. We are going to do radically different things. We are going to transform the global economy. We don't know how to do that yet. By the end of today, hopefully we will. Seriously, by the end of this process, right now, before the crisis gets in full hold, we need to think through and work out what the future looks like. Because the world is going to come asking, right? And they're going to say, actually, you were right. Actually, we need to do things very differently. What should we do now? And you're going to have the answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much. I'm still thrilled every time I hear you. I've heard you before, and I saw you on TED when the lights went out. Actually, that was a great trick. Halfway the story, all the lights went out, and then you asked the people, just imagine what you would feel if this really happens. I was thinking about that. I was thinking about many things, about my daughters and shopping, the constant cycle of stupidity. The thing is, there are many questions, and I'm going to ask you only one because we're in a time schedule. But consumer behavior, I think from my perspective, the new generation feels more a natural urge to live more sustainable than my generation. But how am I going to tell my daughter, who's already vegetarian and only 13 years old, that she shouldn't buy a new iPhone? No.
I think, first of all, you can't tell her. Having kids, you can't tell her, so forget that idea completely. You can tell her, right? And you can tell her by leading a different way of doing things. Your conversation before was little things make a big difference. Right? Don't underestimate just how doing one thing can change things, right? And that's how we change. We change because we see someone else doing it. We feel as though we could be part of that. Different things become cool, right? The reason the Buy Nothing New Month and the idea of having all these sort of campaigns against consumption is to make it cool, right? It's to make it interesting. It's to make it better. The whole idea of we should sacrifice ourselves, right, and not have things we want because the future will be better, is a failed idea. It was right, technically, but it doesn't work, right? So we have to recognise, we have to teach ourselves that having less stuff, right, and the cool people do that things differently, right, and swishing, clothes swapping parties and making it fashionable, all that process is how a meme starts and it moves through society, right? And that's how this generation, I think, is much more inclined to accept that. Right? But let's be really clear. We're going to do this at a mass scale because we'll have no choice. Right? We're not going to suddenly stop shopping as 6 billion or the 3 billion that can afford to. Aren't going to stop shopping because it's the right thing to do. Right? They're not going to be able to do it anymore because the resources won't be available, the money won't be available. And then they'll go, actually, I didn't really enjoy it anyway. It was sort of a stupid, bad phase we went through as humanity. I'm over it now. And we'll sort of retrospectively agree that it was a good idea. But don't try and tell your daughter not to buy anything. I won't. Shall we go shopping then?
But I got the message. Less is more. Well, to end with shopping, I'm going to thank you very much and give you something we shopped. It's the last thing I bought this month. This is yours. This is chocolate and Dutch flowers.
Oh, that doesn't.
For the action
that's
tree.
Fine. That's good. That's
good.
good.
And the other thing you should buy is of course the book. It's here. You can find it during the coffee break. And Maurits, you're the publisher. Thanks for doing this. It's great. And I just told the audience this is the last new thing they're going to buy this month. Paul, many thanks again, and great to have you here. Paul Gilding.
Great, thanks.